Hello and welcome to Psychological Insights. Today's topic is xenophobia, and what an appropriate topic it is given as to what is going on in our country. Why now? Why? Why all of a sudden? Or is it all of a sudden? Today we'll be speaking to Dr. Robert Hamm. He's a psychologist in West Hartford Center, and he's an expert in all things psychological. I'm Pat Kazakoff. Stay with me. So, Dr. Hamm,
Yes, good morning, Pat.
good morning. Good morning. Supposedly, there's 2.3 million people that have been apprehended at our southern border. It seems like a massive refugee crisis. Why now? What is going on in the world that has an impact on this particular this particular syndrome?
Right. Well, there was an article in the Sunday Times this week about a young woman and her daughter who were separated as they were trying to they were from Venezuela. We know about all the problems they're having in Venezuela politically and economically. So many people, including even middle class, and I know this has been going on. Um, when I was uh, in Florida a few years ago before the pandemic, there were taxi drivers and housekeepers who had immigrated to the US from Venezuela, who had been doctors and lawyers. So it's not just poor people. But anyway, the article was about the harrowing journey. Mother and daughter were separated, going through that Darien Gap in Panama. But it was to exemplify what's happening in the world, that there's more migration than ever. And in answer to your question, there are several factors that are contributing to this. We know that there is a horrible regime in Venezuela that has just destroyed their economy and the welfare of many people who live there. But there's also, as we know, the war in Ukraine, and that is causing all kinds of problems in terms of inflation, food shortages, and of course, climate control. These are the three main reasons that we're going through so much turmoil. Um, this has been going on for some time, but it's even getting worse.
So how does this kind of migration affect our psyche? What does it do to everybody who is just there?
Well, I think both the refugee and immigration or immigrant problem, as we all know, build a wall, right? Um, has created it's one of the several political touch points that has been so inflammatory in our nation alone, isn't it? But not just our nation; it's been happening all over the world. But we know it mostly from our nation, of course. We see our news or we see our elections. Um, and so that has contributed to xenophobia, amongst other problems, that many people are concerned that there's too many immigrants coming in. It's changing the makeup of our society. This is nothing new in our country. I mean, it's been going on ever since there has been immigration, hasn't there? A fear of immigrants and people taking our jobs, and a dilution of the quality of our population. The This great replacement theory that
Right.
we
So talk what like those kinds of slogans, America First and the Great Replacement Theory. What exactly is that all about?
Well, I think that whenever there is some kind of crisis, a political crisis, an economic crisis, these immigration, as I was saying, and this is not just now, but this happened during World War II. when during not the fascism during that time, there was a lot of reaction. So Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, was an isolationist and a Nazi sympathizer. And I think he and others coined the term and had big conventions, huge conventions, rallies that were isolationist, that were anti-immigration, and their slogan was "America First." I think there was this famous priest, Father Coughlin. I think that I've seen on TV. I think Rachel Maddow is doing a feature right now.
And I also think that Philip Roth wrote a book. Uh, I cannot recall the name of it, but I remember they televised it on television. And basically, it was all about what you're talking about there. And they showed these mass meetings with Lindbergh, and they had like Nazi reactions. And it seemed crazy to
Yeah,
someone born in this generation that that could have gone unfeathered. But
right.
I think that's what you're talking about.
Right. The name of the book was The Plot Against America.
Yes, 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 you've got it. The Plot
Right.
Against
Right. It
America.
was a very good book, and very chilling. Um, yeah, it's I remember growing up, as a young man thinking, wow, how could people be like that? How could that happen? Um, and never would, we saw what happened in Nazi Germany, but never here. Well, it could have, but now, once again, it's raised its ugly head. And it happens during periods of economic, political turmoil, such as what we're going through throughout the world right now.
Well, so this concept of the other becoming an enemy amongst us, that's what this is about, because obviously America is a country full of immigrants. I mean, that's what we're about. And how does somebody amongst us become the enemy? It defies all logic.
Yeah, it reminds me of that science fiction classic, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers,
Yes.
because it's almost like we're living now in a country that I don't recognize. The animosity and the politicians, loss of integrity, the inflammatory rhetoric. It's so the irony of this is that xenophobia usually refers to fear of strangers, people who are, from elsewhere, on foreign land.
Is that sort of the classic definition? The fear
Right.
of strangers?
Yeah, fear or hostility. But ironically, it seems to be actually happening within our country. That we're losing a sense of camaraderie, and commonality, um, a lack of fealty or brotherhood, if you will, in our country. We don't recognize one another anymore. People are at loggerheads with one another. Families are getting split apart. Um, so, but this is a phenomenon. Andreas Wimmer had written an essay in 1997 who touched on this topic, that xenophobia, that usually refers to foreigners, also could be a phenomenon when there's a loss of economic prosperity that affects certain groups. Those groups that are affected, who lost their social mobility, lost their social and financial standing, are most susceptible to this phenomenon of xenophobia. And we see that happening today with many groups. It affects especially people who are economically in challenged
Or
or stressed,
disadvantaged. So
disadvantaged.
how does the other view this? How does the other view this? We know how the insider views it, but how does the other see himself in relationship to the xenophobia? What is he thinking in his mind?
Well, what we see in that's happening here in the United States is that there is if you will, a culture war going on right now, right? So we have those who are for America, make America great again, America first, whatever you want to call it, isolationism, pretty much, who feel that our our nation, our morals, um, excuse me, and our prosperity is being degraded. Excuse me. But those on the other end are, embrace diversity, openness to alternate ways of living, maybe cultural practices, um, different ethnicities, a diverse and more welcoming uh, sort of ethic, if you will.
Is is there some, you mentioned the phrase America first, and is there some way of looking at this positively, uh, in the way that people are proud of their country and they want to be in charge? Is there some positive element to this concept?
Well, I mean, that's the other side. Proud of our country. That's so when it takes an ugly side to it, which is chauvinism and isolationism. Um, but the we would hope, that eventually that things will turn out. We don't know. We're still in this crisis in our country where democracy, I believe, is in peril. Um, and we could find a way through it and identify those people, those so-called leaders who are troublemakers, who are sort of parasitized from these kinds of conflicts and only exacerbate them. They feed off them. Or, we're going to, I mean, identify those people as destructive to society, or are they will they be embraced as they were in Hitler Germany when they used divisiveness and propaganda?
You're talking all about the sociological aspects, but what about the psychological aspects of the xenophobia phenomenon? What are the psychological uh, underpinnings?
Well, there was a book written back in the 1980s by a psychoanalyst, Hamm. The name of the book was "The Need to Have Allies and Enemies." That I read many years ago was found it fascinating. This idea that uh, paranoia, what we ordinarily think of as a psychological disorder, we can extrapolate to see how it manifests in society. So Volkan wrote a book that this phenomenon of xenophobia, which we could say is manifest in the paranoid personality, a mental disorder, actually is part of something larger, which is what Volkan believes is an inherent sort of need to preserve the self that there is within us as creatures, if you will, um, a tendency to divide.
So is he talking about an instinct, that is an instinct, self-preservation instinct?
Um, well, I wouldn't use it that strictly. I mean, he's a psychoanalyst. Um, they usually don't talk about instincts per se, but it is something that he feels is something that is germane to humanity. It's part of our nature, if you will. It could be our nature in the way that society is structured, the way that social systems tend to coalesce so that you're either in or you're out. Um, but anyway, he believed that individuals have within us a tendency to divide, to differentiate friends from enemies. And this can manifest either at an individual level, let's say, in terms of xenophobia, or even a pathology such as a paranoid personality, or in societies where they become very divisive or authoritarian, um, and fascist governments that feed off of this kind of xenophobia and scapegoatism.
Are there some people who are more susceptible to this proliferation of conspiracy theories? Is there one kind of population that is more attracted to this than others?
Yeah, yes. Back in post-World War II America, Theodore Adorno, who was an immigrant himself during the Holocaust, um, uh, started a whole series of studies on authoritarianism and fascism, and came up with a personality test called the authoritarian personality, wrote a book about it, and identified different kinds of features that this type of individual has, such as a susceptibility to religiosity or superstition, a submissiveness to authority, distrust, um, valuing power, a lack of self-reflectiveness, uh, and uh, and then getting back to Vlamek Volkin, the psychoanalyst, he said that this tendency to divide leads to a kind of regressive psychological kinds of coping mechanisms, such as shibboleths and mysticism and conspiracy theories. And we're seeing a lot of that today.
Yes, I'm listening to you, and I'm relating to it strongly. And I'm also hearing, but you're not saying, would men be more susceptible to this kind of thinking? Or is that too general? Is that just an oversimplification and a generality?
Yeah, well, I didn't realize that I wasn't saying that it wasn't deliberate.
No.
In defense of my own gender, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, I think so. That you bring it up, there is some research that has shown, empirical research, experimental research, where they would actually give people injections with hormones, that testosterone does exacerbate distrustfulness. So men have more testosterone generally than women do. And so, yeah, that could be a reason. I think it's also socialization, how boys are raised, and men in our culture. But yeah, men. I mean, we keep bashing men, don't we, on this
I'm
program?
not bashing men.
No, I'm
I'm
not
not
saying that.
bashing men, but it just as you were talking, that's what I was hearing. I was hearing that in the conversation. So I wanted to ask.
Yeah, well, I would say you're probably right, Pat. When it comes to aggression and pathologies of aggression and distrustfulness, yeah, men are the primary culprits. That's right.
Well, culprit is a strong word, but it's
Well,
your
what's
word.
acceptable?
Yeah, they
Yeah,
might be more susceptible,
yeah.
and for just for that reason, that biological reason that they have more testosterone. That could be it.
But I think it's also how we're raised. Boys and girls in our culture, in all cultures, pretty much, are raised differently. And so, combination of nurture and nature is usual.
So what is this concept of the otherness? The otherness. You talk about it in your blog online that
Mhm.
you produce for for public reading. And what is the otherness? I have never heard that term before.
Well, it's a broad term, but it's a term that I've always been fascinated by. I'm interested in philosophy, and philosophers often refer to this idea but it is germane to what the topic of today's show, xenophobia, because xenophobia is a fear or hostility towards the other, the stranger, people we're not familiar with, that were foreign to us. Um, so uh, otherness is a topic that many philosophers, such as Immanuel Levinas, a Lithuanian philosopher, and Martin Buber, the famous Austrian philosopher, who wrote a book called I, Thou, were concerned about. Um, and there's a famous quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, the existential philosopher, who said that hell is other people, um, which sort of points to this idea of otherness. Um, although Sartre is referring to human nature, that we tend to, we identify, we become who we are only through our relations with other people. We've discussed this in this
Oh,
show
yes,
before.
I think we've talked about this.
Yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah,
Um, and so, what he is saying that, that we cannot escape our human relations. If we are, as individuals, human relations is what makes us individuals. And in so doing, we cannot avoid seeing ourselves through the eyes of others. That's projective identification.
yeah, you've talked about projective identification also as a
Right. This is a
as a
term that
topic.
was introduced by the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein back in the early 1900s. And many writers have picked up on this as a concept that is a psychodynamic by which we build an identity, a sense of self, but it also can be the source of xenophobia, because through this projective process, other people become imbued with our emotions, so that we see others as embodying qualities that not necessarily are objectively true, but rather they are projections of our fears and our animosities. That's projective identification. And the famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung wrote about, and now a book has been published on his writings on flying saucers, that he believed that this phenomenon is another example of how projective identification, they're not real flying saucers, but rather they're projections. People believe in them or think about them because they represent fears that are part of what Jung called our shadows, part of the collective unconscious. That is the part of ourselves, our animosities, our fears, our hostilities, that we don't own. Instead, we project it out there into someone else or this other aliens from outer space.
Oh, this is getting very I mean, this
Yeah,
is
so there's a very good another science fiction classic, Forbidden Planet, which was based on this Jungian concept of projective identification.
so
And flying saucers.
this projective identification uh, is the source for xenophobia, source for racism. Is that, would that be
Well, that's the
correct?
psychological source, but there's also, as we said at the beginning of our show today, there are all these social factors that are contributing today: climate change and economic upheaval, um, uh, and the refugee problem. All of that, I think, contributes to xenophobia.
So what can we do to count? I mean, xenophobia is not a positive word. And what can we do to counter this? Or is there anything that we can do? Is there something instinctual about protecting oneself against the other?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the practical things you can do are, to support people who are being vilified or persecuted because they are identified as different or immigrants. Um, Join an organization or a political cause. Um, But at a psychological level, ironically, this concept of projective identification, according to Melanie Klein, Carl Jung, is also another. It is another way that we as humans can integrate those sort of projected parts of ourselves. And it is that if we learn to own that what we fear, it's like Roosevelt's famous saying, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. If
Mhm.
we can own that, that it isn't the people themselves that are dangerous, but it is our fear, our sense of insecurity, because we are feeling insecure in our standing in life right now. That there's a lot of change going on, and we're financially stressed, or whatever those reasons are. So if we can own it instead of project it, so that's one way. Um, but getting back to the philosophers Martin Buber and Emmanuel Levinas, uh, they take a much more spiritual approach in dealing with the problem, so to speak, of the other. In so Buber, uh, in his writings, he talks about two ways of conceptualizing our relationships, because we're basically relational beings. One is the I-it, in which we see the world and other people and things or whatever as things, objects, which causes alienation and therefore more susceptible to xenophobia, or the I thou, which is the encounter with the other, as he calls it.
Is
Uh,
is that the ich du,
yeah,
I you? Ich.
right. Yes, which is a much deeper relationship in which you establish a relationship with the other with a sense of empathy, respect, and dignity. And he believed, Buber, being a spiritual person, that in so doing, this brings us in relation to God, um, because God is in all things. But we cannot see that until we realize the divinity, if you will, of all things in nature. This goes back to Spinoza's philosophy back in the 16th century. And then Levinas, he believed that philosophy throughout the centuries has made a mistake in endeavoring to try to find out what is the essence of truth and reality, uh, in because he feels that in order for us to truly be able to relate, we are relational creatures to one another. The first thing that we should establish is an ethical relationship, not one that attempts to understand or know, because whenever we try to understand and know, we always fall short, and inevitably judge, and this causes a kind of violence, if you will, against the so-called other. So instead of trying to understand, grasp, comprehend, um, whatever it is that we're unfamiliar with and fearful of, we should open ourselves to the mystery of the other without judgment. Uh,
And that would be the ethical obligation, on a very practical level. It's just living side by side with your neighbor, although you have different perspectives.
Right. So, I mean, this is a psychological maneuver, if you will, that Levinas and Hoover are referring to. There are practical things you can do, as I was saying, but there are also spiritual and psychological um, efforts that you can make to open your mind and your heart to all that don't understand, which is a very challenging thing to do, especially in today's world with all of the animosity is that we are facing.
Well, I'm listening to you and I'm hearing everything you're saying. And it's much more complex than I originally thought this topic of xenophobia would be. And there seems to be a lot of literature behind it and a lot of study that has been done. But in the end, you have to live with your neighbor in an ethical way. And I think we're all capable of that. It seems like a reasonable solution, Dr. Hamm. And with that, um, thank you very much for another extremely interesting topic and opening our eyes to things that, opening our eyes and opening our hearts to ideas that we're not familiar with. So thank you very much, Dr. Hamm.